Okay, it being 7:30, special start time, we will begin this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item of business is citizen comments. No citizens are present to comment, so we will go to the next item, which is approval of the May 21st Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do I hear a motion?
I motion that we accept the minutes as written.
Second.
Been moved and seconded to approve the May 21st minutes. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes pass unanimously. Next agenda item is the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan, vision, goals, and policy support. I believe our city staff will be joining us shortly to discuss this next item. So I welcome the city staff to join us up here. Yes, you can catch your breath, Debbie. That's okay.
Well, good evening. I do have a PowerPoint for you, so let me search for that. You want to pull your screens up? That would be fantastic. Sorry about that. Well, you're stuck with me this evening, I'm afraid. So tonight we're going to continue our discussion about the PROS plan, and tonight we're going to talk about vision, goals, and policies. And when your packet went out, you had a copy of what is currently in the PROS plan, and then later in the week we sent you sort of a revised draft. So what I'm going to do is sort of quickly go through those revisions. The reason why I didn't send it to you in strike changes is it was kind of too messy to do that. But for the most part, there is sort of a crosswalk between the old and the new. There are not really any significant changes. So what informs moving forward with the PROS plan? We conducted a statistically valid community survey earlier in the year, and those results were presented to the council on May 13th, and some of you may have seen that, and if you didn't know that, there is a link to the results online. So this is just a quick summary of the results, showing what the top priorities were for facilities, and they're not in priority order, I have to say. And some of these we have seen in previous survey results. Access to the waterfront continues to be a top priority for the community, an indoor swimming pool, nature trails, and the list goes on. So this is something that we keep in mind about what the community says they would like to see in the future for park facilities. And the next slide is also showing what the community said was important in terms of programs and activities. And surprisingly, in the survey, there was a lot of feedback about wanting to see more programming, particularly in terms of adult programming. And as you know, the city's model, we're not really in the recreation programming business. The model that the city has taken is that the city would provide either the land or the facilities and partner with others to provide the programming. And we have several examples of that currently. The Kenmore Waterfront and Activity Centre, for example, operating out of Squires Landing. The city provided the facilities there, and KWAC is now doing the programming there for the water sports. So when we took a look at revising the vision, goals, and policy, we had 3 questions in mind as we did this first draft. First of all, do the vision, goals, and...
I'm sorry, Debbie, can we ask questions?
Yeah, no. Yes, of course you can ask questions.
It was about the survey specifically. So I did stick around. I think some others of us did when it was presented to the council, and they might have come up then. First of all, were there any young people who answered the survey? Do you have any more information about the, I guess, the demographics of who?
Yes, we actually
survey?
did ask the consultant to go back and double check to make sure that the survey results represented the demographics of the community, and they did. So let me make a note to myself here, and I can provide that to you so you can actually see.
I think that would be
what
helpful.
that would look like.
I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely, no
Yeah, and
problem.
the other thing was, I wonder if was there any question, I don't think there was, based on the presentation, about people's willingness to pay for any of these facilities, or was this more of a wish list of what they would, ideally like to see the city provide?
There was nothing particular in this about how much you would be willing to pay for these facilities. It was more a question of what you would like and what would be your top priorities. So there was some ranking in there within the survey, but it didn't really get into the funding. Typically, when you're asking funding questions, that's when you're getting more specific to the communities. Would you be willing to pay for, and for what? So, for example, in 2015, there was a significant community outreach, the Imagine Kenmore, and some of you may remember that, when the community was specifically asked, what would you like to see? And then how much would you pay for that? And that's what kind of led into the Walkways and Waterways bond measure. So typically, you get into those kind of questions when you want to ask the community more of, are you willing to pay for something? So this is more in terms of what you would want or like to see, or what are your top priorities.
Right. Okay. I asked that largely because of the interest of ongoing in a pool. Specifically, that's obviously
Yes.
a high capital
It is.
expense and maintenance item. So I just wondered what the will there be follow up then, or does that depend on how this how the pros plan goes and what the council decides, or?
So how this moves forward, so we had the survey results, now we're looking at the goals and policies, and the next thing that we'll be coming back to talk to you about would be the demand and needs analysis, and then from that then you develop a list of capital projects. So these are how the pieces all fit together. So when you're looking at the demand and need, you're then going back to take a look at the survey results, looking at what some of the national standards and other standards there are for facilities, and then you come back and develop a list of projects. For something like a swimming pool or an aquatic centre, that is something that the city will not be able to manage on its own. And over the years, there have been previous efforts to look at providing a regional pool. So I think if that moved forward, I think the way to get something big, like a huge expense like that, would be through a regional facility and regional partnerships.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm sorry if I'm busy not paying attention. Please let me know. So again, when we were looking at where we start to update the vision, goals, and policy, we felt that the current pros plan did a pretty good job. It's not that we're starting from scratch. This is basically a refinement. It's a periodic update. So what we're really trying to focus on is, do the goals and policies and vision reflect what the community would like to see, what their needs are? Is there anything missing that needs to be added? And then what we always try and do when we're doing an update is try and look at making a document consistent, concise, and easy to understand. So this was the framework that we used when we were putting this draft together. And this is not the final draft, it's a first draft, and it will be further refined based on your input. And we also need then to keep going back and making sure then that there is internal consistency as we kind of move through the pros plan, that these policies and goals support the demand and needs and sort of reflect what the list of projects will be at the end. So there's going to be some continuing back and forth and refinement as we move through this pros plan update. So we also took a look at should some policies be removed. And there were several policies that we did remove, and they fell into two categories. The first category was taking out those policies which reflect projects that have been completed after 2013, since the last pros plan was updated. So you will see there that there are 5 policies that reflect projects that have been complete. So we removed those out of the mix for now. And there are 2 categories there where there was some redundancy or repetitiveness that we also removed those as well. Looking at the vision, the pros plan vision would need to be consistent with the overall vision of the comprehensive plan, and the latest vision was adopted in 2015, and it's looking forward to 2035. So the pros plan would need to support the vision items that are listed, including supporting recreation and health through well-maintained parks, trails, and open spaces. So that one speaks directly to the pros plan. But there are several other things that might, for example, in the vision, connecting to the waterfront is listed in the vision, providing safe pedestrian and bike linkages, providing downtown spaces, encouraging volunteerism. These are all reflected in the vision, and you'll see some of these items also reflected in the pros plan. We also added something new, and this is the city service vision, and this is something that the city staff worked on internally to kind of think, what is it that the city does? And it is pretty close to the comprehensive plan vision, but I think it's pretty powerful. Propelling Kenmore upward, we create a thriving community where people love where they live. So we might include that in the pros plan as well as the vision, just because I think it's a sort of captures and is applicable to the pros plan. So the next thing in the current pros plan, there are guiding fundamentals, which is the principal condition, which kind of sets out the framework for the park system. And it's really focused around the natural environment. You see, the waterways are important, the wildlife and natural habitat areas, wetlands. These are all part of the natural environment, and they truly frame the park system that we currently have. Along with that, the key values which are represented in the pros plan, we feel are still valid and something that we need to pay attention to. Protection and stewardship, and this boils down to having responsible planning, management, and conservation when we look at the park system. Partnerships is very important, and I think will be an ongoing theme. We feel this is the most efficient and cost-effective way, particularly to look at recreation programming. And we have examples of other partnerships. For example, we have a lease agreement with Basta University for use of the ball field. That's a very good example of a partnership. The third key value is creating balance. And this is something that we consider there should be a balance between passive and active recreation, and there should be opportunities for everybody to be able to use the park system. Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question about, how you define balance. Are you talking about, equal opportunities? Are you talking about equal, amounts of passive and active recreation, or just how are you looking at I guess what balance means in practice?
Just in looking at the values, we're not really quantifying that, although that's something we could kind of take a look at. But this is kind of just the an overall theme is that we try and create balance. There might not be balance currently. I would say we certainly have a lot more passive parks and recreation than we do active. And again, that's sort of an outcome of the land and area that we have. It is really focused on the natural environment, but we strive to provide that balance because there is also a need for active recreation and a need for different opportunities. But there isn't really a quantification in terms of acres or facilities, at least in the values. Yes.
Talked about not having a major by acres and so forth. Is that something we'll eventually get to? There was
Yes.
a nice Seattle Times article in the last week or so where they were talking about what to convert to housing and so forth. But they did a comparison of how much.
Yes.
I just wondered if we'll end up with that as we go through the process.
Yes, and you won't have to wait very long. Next week, actually, I think it is when I think it's next week, we'll be coming back to you with talking about the demand and needs analysis. And that's where we look at things like national standards for what is required, and we look at other measures as a comparison. So yes, that is certainly part of it. Welcome.
As long as we've interrupted you for a minute,
Yes,
a question.
no problem.
One of the things I was wondering, is there any information data we have or could get related to the economic value of parks and recreation programs? You know, one of the things I personally have heard lots of folks coming up to me and saying, you know, I really enjoy coming up to Rhododendron Park. I really enjoy Log Boom. I really enjoy going to St. Edwards. And as we think about how small we really are and relative to what we have to offer other communities, I'm wondering if there isn't a way to capture some of that economic benefit for the city.
Yes, and I would say when we recently updated the park impact fees, we looked at the assets that we had and we put a value on those assets. So that's something that we could certainly share with you.
So I was thinking, impact fees certainly are a good way to get it, but I was even thinking about if we're developing parks and recreation opportunities that bring people from other areas, we're creating traffic that has economic value to businesses and other services that might want to locate here. And I'm concerned that we might lose that in some of our thinking, and particularly when we set our priority settings. If I know, looking at our agenda for the future, one of the things we're going to be talking about is what do we want to do in terms of zoning for office space? What do we want to do to attract other businesses here? This is the sort of amenities that are attractive to higher level folks who would support higher rental or leasing and could provide higher quality jobs as well as residents. So is there a way we can, or is it appropriate to consider that as we go through the pros plan?
I don't know if there's any specific local data for Kenmore, but I think it's safe to say that if you have a good park system, it does help property values and economic development, and is a part of that. So in terms of quantifying it specifically for Kenmore, I'll have to think about that.
Even if we can't quantify it, is this the sort of thing we might want to include in our goals and objectives?
Okay.
And it is really easy to see how doing a bit of that work would be an asset when we actually get to the, coming up with the plan for the future. How do we decide which projects will be more beneficial? We're going to look at what the public said to us, but if we had some economic analysis of what a park system does for a city, that might also influence those projects and the priority of them. And I agree. I think, though we don't have these office hubs now, we will. And having people be able to work, live, and play in an area like this is pretty attractive without having to commute to downtown Seattle.
I mean, just thinking about maybe a more concrete example, We have already within the pros plan the concept of the city acquiring property and how we might use that. Financing that is part of the pros plan in
Yes.
one of always a stumbling block. If we were to consider the fact that if we were to acquire a piece of property that would have an attractive amenity on it, that would be attractive to potential employers or to new residents, new services or offices development, for instance, that's something that would help defray the cost of that. So we wouldn't necessarily have to lean on resident taxes, bonding, or loans to be able to do that. It may make a larger project more feasible if we have a sense of what the value of that is and how we could capture it, whether it was through sales taxes, whether it was increased business that came into existing businesses or attracted new businesses, property values, property taxes on higher use development. I think that might make a project more economically justifiable than you would have if we didn't take that into account.
And going off of that, not just new people coming in that could help economically, but also existing. If we can create attractive parks and amenities that some of the existing residents have, they're more likely to stay within the city as opposed to taking their business outside of the city, or not just their business, but going outside of the city and therefore taking, any expenditures that they have outside of the city. And so I think that is a fair point. And especially for a lot of the youth, I know that they depend on the parks, or not just depend, but they love them, and they're in the parks quite often. I know just for myself, I was just there down at Log Boom just a few days ago, and there are many more like me who spend a lot of their days at the park within our city. And if we can make them more attractive, or if we can capitalize on these partnerships and whatnot, we can keep some of that economic benefits here within the city as opposed to it leaving to other cities with more attractive parks.
And we do attract regionally already, but if we can think about our powerful statement about propelling Kenmore upward when we go through this, it does make sense to think of it in an economic term, even though in general we don't think of the parks as, this high value. But when you think about the cities that don't have any, and look at what we have. I mean, we have gems that we really need to steward.
I think that's an essential point. We are in competition. There are other communities who want the jobs, want the businesses that we'd like to attract. So what are those businesses looking for? And I think if you just look down the lake little bit to Kenmore, what brought Google, what brought the other firms into Kenmore? Into Kirkland.
Yeah.
I remember what Kirkland looked like 20 years ago. They made a lot of changes, very purposeful changes, and they reaped the benefits that they've been able to collect in new property taxes and new sales taxes, and be able to reinvest that. We don't have that, but we could. We have a nice competitive advantage over most communities in the type of park and recreation activities that we currently have already that we could enhance, and I think would put us in a better position. We just have to figure out how to finance that. So I think linking those two concepts into a development plan through the pros could be valuable to us.
And some of the way to do that is in this aspirational stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. I know you guys have been kind of massaging what's already there, but, taking the projects that are completed out totally makes sense. What are we going to put in their place?
Well, that is going to be, that will be coming up. So we have to kind of take a look at then, again, looking at the survey results, looking at the demand and need analysis, which is the next thing that you will be looking at. And then from that, developing a list of projects. And then that list of projects, which might be sort of an unconstrained financial list. And then you have to then take that and put it into a 6-year constrained financial list, which is a 6-year capital improvement program. So some of the projects might be very, very long-term. Some might be more mid-term. And then you look at what is in the 6-year park capital improvement project. And if you look at the park CIP right now, the main projects which are on that list are the Log Boom Waterfront Project, which was the Waterways and Waterways Bond Measure, the Squires Landing Improvement Project, again, the Waterways Bondway Measure, the Rhododendron Boathouse Project, those are probably the three most significant projects in terms of funding.
Yeah,
So-
these are all really good points. I just wanted maybe a clarifying question. When you talk about, I guess your inventory of the assets and the value, are you including the Burke Gilman and St. Ed's? Because those seem to be two things that have particular, economic value. The Burke Gilman, obviously brings a lot of people through Kenmore, and I assume some of the people stop and spend money here. And St. Ed's is definitely a regional attraction. So I just was curious if that was part of the economic equation that the city is using.
Well, those are facilities that we don't own, so we
Right.
have less control over them. So I think the focus is largely going to be on assets and things that we have control of. And the other things then you would recognize their importance and value being in the community for a recreation asset and the partnerships there. But putting a value on those
Would be,
as a would might be difficult.
yeah.
So from what I've kind of heard you say, and I'll have to sort of think about this, so there are two things we can bring back in terms of valuation. We have certainly a good list of what our current assets would be valued at in terms of the facilities that we have. And then what you're also asking for then is some sort of way of putting a value or a quantification on the park system and how that ripples through to economic development, including looking at encouraging businesses and residents to stay. So I need to think about that. I don't have an answer, but I hope that captures what you're looking for.
So I don't know if you see articles, best places to live,
Mhm.
best places to start a business, if there's criteria that you can find in those kinds of articles that
Yeah.
might lead us towards quantifying.
I know there's research out there and I know there's documentation. What I don't know, though, is if the ability to sort of look at Kenmore specific. So we might have to infer that connection rather than actually having the data to support it. But I understand the question, and I'll have to get back to you on that one, I'm afraid. So it's good conversation, good comments. And the last key value there was instilling civic pride. And again, I think some of the actions that the city has taken do that. We have the hangar and plaza, which are great community gathering spaces in the downtown, and it's certainly a sense of civic pride from the comments we've been hearing back from the community who use that. There are other things like public art in the community is another way to instill civic pride. Encouraging volunteerism is another thing that encourages civic pride. So again, these are the key values which currently exist in the PROS plan, and we felt are still relevant as we move forward.
And these key values, I know it states that they're desirable to Kenmore residents. Are they looked at or applied to parks that are being updated or maybe new parks that are being introduced? Are these each kind of looked at
These
and
are yes.
valued? Okay.
Yes,
It's the
yes.
framework,
These are certainly valued, and you will sort of see those reflected in the goals and policies and objectives. These kind of try and reflect these values as we
Mhm.
develop those goals, policies, and objectives. So again, that's something to keep in mind as you are reviewing them as a commission. Is do they reflect these key values?
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yes, absolutely.
Are the key values something that we want to measure, or whether we're meeting them or not with what we're doing?
It's a question, so I guess we can say, is there a way to, how would we quantify those? So I think that's something we should take a look at in the PROS plan, is as we are implementing these actions, what are the measures we're using to measure success? So I will certainly make a note of that as well. So in the PROS plan, we need to be realistic and look at some of the obstacles that are in front of us when you try and implement this, because you have to kind of take that in mind. We're not working with a blank slate here and a flat piece of land. So these are some of the things that were in the current PROS plan, and we added a new one, which is securing assets for future generations. And the reason that we added that, and we thought that was important, is as the city grows and ages along with growing, it's important to take a look at your assets and have a plan for repair of those assets, repair and replacement. So we wanted to make sure that was included in the list. But the rest of the list here they are all currently in the PROS plan.
I have a question about level of detail. I was kind of comparing the new to the old, and in some cases there are sections that are more detailed, and in other cases we've tried to simplify in the new. And so I was wondering, it has a feeling of a draft document, and so I was just curious if you're aiming at a certain level of detail for each item, or what your thoughts are when you created the document.
I think when we first went through this, we were trying to be as concise as we could. And so I think the lens to take a look at that is, have we, by being concise, lost something? And so if you feel that in some of these areas that we have lost something, then let us know and we can add it back in or refine it or something. So again, that was the lens we were looking at, trying to be concise, but certainly something to consider. Again, in the current PROS plan, there was also a list of opportunities. And what we did in this section, we kind of said, are these still relevant? And we did update those, particularly updating the walkways and waterways, because I think there has been, significant activities since 2013, and we wanted to make sure that was reflected in the opportunities section. So that is sort of by way of background before we dive into this. Before we do, again, I think I mentioned that this is not the one and only time to take a look at this. This is a first cut. We will be reviewing this, but if you have any specific comments about these, again, keeping in mind the lens that we were trying to be consistent, we were trying to be concise. Is anything missing here? Those are sort of the main things that we want you to be thinking of as we review this. The other thing is that the objectives and policies all basically fall into 5 areas. And so you'll see that they're either related to acquisition and development, they're related to stewardship, or planning, or partnerships, or funding sources. So when you see these, you will kind of see these are sort of the 5 areas that are reflected as we walk through this. So starting with goal number 1, provide waterfront access. We looked at that and we broadened that goal from the previous PROS plan to broaden it to waterfront access. And we divided it into 2 objectives: developing a Kenmore water walk, which was previously in the PROS plan, and then adding a new policy, which is why I've included it on the slide here, for extending the trail system at Squires Landing Park along the Sammamish River. Now you might think, well, there isn't a trail system there right now, and you would be right in thinking that, because the trail system is part of the Squires Landing waterfront project, which will be implemented by 2023. So the other thing that was changed in this section, other than the reorganization, was making a reference to water-dependent recreation. We thought that was important, as this is focused on waterfront access, that there should be some acknowledgement that water-dependent recreation is important. Well, before I click to the next goal, policies and actions, I want to make sure that as you had reviewed this document, any sort of initial reactions to how this was reorganized, or feeling that we've missed anything? Because this is one that there was a lot of changes to.
Well, I'm a little curious about I'm just trying to think about Squires Landing and heading east along the Sammamish River and/or Swamp Creek. What's the, I guess, potential extent of such a trail system to the city borders, or at least to the east and going north on Swamp Creek? What's the concept, anyways? I kind of get an idea, I kind of understand it, but can you tell us a little more about what you have in mind there?
Well, I think this is specific to Squires Landing. So I think what it's saying is that once the waterfront project is complete, there will be some trail system in there, but it is only focused on a small portion of the overall park. So there is an opportunity there in the future to extend that trail system through Squires Landing Park, and kind of, so you have a trail system throughout the park. So I think when it's talking about the Sammamish River and Swamp Creek, it's really focused on the Squires Landing property.
Within the property, okay.
Yes.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes.
I think the last time we did it, we also talked, at least conceptually, about potentially, say, a boardwalk trail along the Swamp Creek wetlands. Commissioner Vanderline may or may not remember that. But that's a separate, yeah, so I was just trying to envision what that might that look like. I know this I don't know if this is a question, but the Kenmore Water Walk, I take it is, again, more in the central area here. And I just wonder about at least the latest demise of Lake Point, and does that affect how the city's looking at that prospect? Because obviously it would require, as I think it's noted here, some private land for the Kenmore Water Walk itself.
So I think the idea is that we would try and get a connection from Log Boom to Squires, but recognizing that, the city has control over the two end pieces and not so much over the parts in between. So what we have to then think about is what would be a way to obtain that access. Well, you can go out and acquire land, you could look at obtaining easements, you could then, as properties develop between those two park properties, make sure that as that property develops, that there is opportunities for, putting in the missing link. So it's sort of a aspirational to get that trail, recognizing that it's going to take a long time to get, because I think realistically we are going to have to wait for development, and Lake Point is a prime example, and they have a large portion of that water walk. But if it does come in for redevelopment, there is a requirement to have access to the water and a trail.
Okay. And I remember, I think, as I recall last time when we talked about the proposed plan in 2013, there was at least some, aspirational ideas that this, water walk could at least theoretically be expanded, beyond the borders of Kenmore. Is that still at least, an aspirational type of idea? Connect with other cities, Kirkland, potentially Lake Forest Park, which already exists with the Burke Gilman to some extent.
I think that if we were considering doing a water walk along the Sammamish River or along Lake Washington, outside of the city, then I think we would need to expand this, because I don't think that speaks to that specifically. So I'll make a note of that.
Okay. Yeah, that was obviously beyond our, immediate sort of jurisdiction, but I know it was an idea that had been raised.
Debbie, in the earlier document, by each of the policy items, that they have the AD, S, FC, and PP. Will that be added later, or are we leaving that out? I notice it's mentioned in the new document on page 5. It has them in parentheses after the P1.2.
Yes.
So I wasn't sure.
I think what we would plan on doing is put that in the section that deals with projects, and then we'll have a table that talks about the projects and how they line under acquisition and development and renovation. So it's just it's not that we're saying that that's not important, but I think we're looking at maybe it makes sense to have it in a different section of the plan.
Okay.
Okay. So the next goal is providing safe routes to the park recreation and open space facilities. And so I think, again, in this one, it's pretty similar to what was currently in the pros plan. We've tried to sort of be concise about this. And then we've added sort of a new policy in there, which is why I put that in here. So I didn't list all the policies, I just kind of highlighted the new ones. So if you've had a chance to take a look at goal number 2 and the objectives and policies, then, let me know if you have any questions. But I think the intent of this, we want to make sure that we have a clear, safe routes map for pedestrian and bikes. We want to plan, and this maybe Mark speaks to your question about the North-South Trail, a trail along the Swamp Creek corridor, that's in this section. Acquire easements and develop the tote trail to adjoining cities. So again, that's the connection piece there to adjoining cities, and developing regulations for new ped bike routes. So that's really the nuts and bolts of this.
So in the previous one, there was an item, seek external funding sources. And I think that item occurs throughout the old plan for a variety of things. And it appears that maybe that's been sort of consolidated under a new heading in the new plan. Is that to reduce the redundancy?
It was to reduce the redundancy and kind of have that in one section. Okay.
Well,
Any questions?
Yeah, maybe not a question, Mr. Comment. I really like the idea of having a plan such as this, which I assume would be, distributed by the city, right? So residents and others could know where these routes are. I think that communications piece is, is a really important part of this whole parks, recreation, open space, letting people know what's available within Kenmore, and maybe even to the extent possible, in other areas. Like, we don't have a public pool per se, but do we let people know that there are other public pools in the in neighboring cities? Is that something we could, in terms of our communications with for parks and recreation, and letting people know that there are facilities, but they may not be in Kenmore, but they are available relative proximity?
Let me check in with our recreation coordinator, because I know they were working on a handout or a guidebook or something on recreation facilities. So let me
Sure.
check and see where that is.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next goal. Again, this is another one where we try to combine prior goals 3 and 6. And so again, this is kind of another area where there were some changes, and we did that to hopefully have clarity, but I guess I'll wait and see if there's any feedback on this. So there is basically, if you looked at the old plan and the new plan, there is sort of some crosswalking here between the objectives and the policies. But we just really tried to focus on this one for enhancing the natural environment and maintaining that built environment. So is there any questions on the changes that are in goal 3?
I'm just curious about the change from habitat to vegetation management plan. 3.1.7, I think in the original it had referenced habitat, and in the new one it has vegetation management.
Okay.
I'm just curious about that.
Okay. I will check and see if there's a distinct difference between the two. That. I do apologize for this being a fairly dry PowerPoint.
You don't need to apologize.
I was putting this together this morning. I had in about half an hour. So goal 4 again. This is
Actually,
getting,
Debbie, before you move on, just
Yes, that's-
one, I had one note for myself here. Question one. In policy P3.1.7, we talk about vegetation management plans for parks with critical areas. Are we limiting our vegetation management plan to just parks with critical areas? Or I'm wondering why we limited it to parks with critical areas and how that really. Yeah, I'm wondering if we don't want to just strike with critical areas and make it parks in general.
so I think that I might be able to tie that also to the question that Suzanne asked about why was it changed from habitat to vegetation, and whether that has any relevance for parks with or without critical areas. In other words, then, should there be two policies, one that talks about with critical areas and one without?
Or one that talks about vegetation management and one that talks about habitat management?
Right.
Or habitat preservation?
Yes.
Like you were trying to get it all in one sentence.
Again, and that
Good
might be
try.
good try. That might be one of those instances where being concise, we may have lost something. So I have that. I see how that's confusing. So the next goal we would be looking at then would be goal number 4, creating a balance of passive and active recreation opportunities in parks. And I think, this is also trying to recognize that, again, it's sort of aspirational. It's something that we should try and do and create that diverse opportunities for everyone. So this is really the purpose of this goal.
Debbie, I know I already brought this up earlier. I mean, is it something we could consider to maybe further define what we think, an appropriate balance would be? Or is that just getting too stuck in the weeds there? Because when I think of a balance, when I read this, I mean, I almost go to, okay, there's pretty much equal opportunities, but as you noted, there currently really isn't, just because of the nature of our city, more passive opportunities. I just throw that out there. Does anybody else think there might be a need to maybe further define or refine what we mean by balance? And I know it's aspirational, and they're not going to ask for a percentage breakdown or anything like that, but I just throw that out there. So.
Well, for me, it gets back to how we're going to measure our success. So if we say that we're looking for a balance, and that's used frequently to describe something that we want, how will we know when we've achieved that balance? So that would be my concern.
So I think I've made note about that, saying how do we define balance and how do we measure balance? So how do we include those two concepts in the pros plan? Because if you have something in there and you want to know if have we met it, and if you can't meet it, then maybe we need to speak a little bit more to the challenges of getting that balance, that we might not be able to get an equal balance or have everything.
Right.
So, yeah, I see that would be important to have.
Actually had an issue that I was trying to think where it fits into this, so maybe it given the conversation, maybe it fits here. One of the things I've been thinking about is when you think about what the public demand is going to be for parks and recreation in the future, we're in the midst of some significant changes, forcing some significant changes, particularly in the density within our community. As density increases, the sorts of needs and wants of people actually in the fairly near future, are going to be very different. So you can think about the things that Kenmore as a sparsely populated bedroom community might see and may be available on your own, even single family lot, as we do more infill, as we have more units per acre, as we start looking at other sorts of infill, we might want to allow ancillary units and things of that nature. Some of those opportunities are going to go away, and as you have that more density, and particularly maybe as the demographics change, how we would want to use public spaces is going to change from what it was and maybe what's in the survey results we have today, because our population is going to be different. So I wonder, how do we account for that when we talk about balance? Is that part of the...
Yeah, you guys really want to jump to the demands and needs. It's what I'm hearing is that you are ready to dive into that to kind of look at the projections of what the growth will look like, how do we meet those needs, what is the demand going to look like, how do we use those spaces. So a lot of that is going to be in demand and needs. So I will let Maureen know that you guys are ready to jump in and have a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, and maybe what it is we're talking here about, when we're talking about goals and objectives, is one of our goals that we want to reflect in our inventory of parks and recreation opportunities, the changing nature of our population and density. And then how do we develop objectives and policies that would reflect that?
And do we even have the data to project that?
There's one of our objectives is to acquire that data.
Yeah,
And how do we use it?
but some of it might also be, since this is kind of the more aspirational part of it, it isn't a technical answer.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're working on isn't necessarily the technical part of balance. It's more, what are we missing in this passive and active rec system?
I would say it's a little of both. And I think it gets back to some of the comments and questions that you've been throwing my way, is that yes, it's aspirational, but how do you measure success? So I think there needs to be we're talking about balance, that balance of being aspirational, but also being to measure success. So I think that seems to be a theme that you've brought up, and I need to make sure that we address and how we're going to address that in the PROS plan.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but having lived in the city for 30 plus years, for 29 or 25 of those years, change wasn't a big issue. And it was a pretty steady state, but we know that that's going to change. So when we're talking about a public need and goals, objectives, and policies, that's something we haven't had to deal with in the past. So how do we reflect that as we do our goal settings and the related objectives? I think that's something new that we have to have in here, and probably elsewhere, some of the other plans we look at.
Okay, I've so noted.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point too. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I mean, there's probably several hundred new residents just, across the street. Certainly since 2013 and many more to come. So yeah, I want to second that point.
I think a lot of our perspectives will change too once we jump into the housing element next time, because that is part of the change, is we will have residents, we don't really know what their needs are. And we're trying to accommodate this big wave of density, but how do we think about what will those new residents need in our park system, and can we meet the need? And,
So this is looking forward. So this is a plan that is looking forward as a way to accommodate growth. So this is the element that looks at what parks facilities do you need to serve that future growth. So this is the element that you do that in the comprehensive plan.
And I think it'd almost be interesting to hear back from maybe the next generation of citizens of the city of Kenmore, and that could be youth within the schools and whatnot, about what they think they're missing from the parks and what they want to see when they do advance on to the next level in life, where they are home buyers and citizens, and what are some things that we could offer them, or at least work on now, so that when they do get reach that point that they stay within the city of Kenmore, or maybe attract other the next kind of generation of home buyers and citizens of that same kind of generation. So that might be just an idea. We don't have to do that, but it just kind of occurred to me, if we ask kind of and see what the trend is going on right now, or what they think we're missing, it could help us prepare for when they're the next kind of group of home buyers or looking for a city to live in.
Yeah, I think goal 6 is new with engage the community in parks, recreation, and open space. I think a lot of the kind of some stray items along that were put into that section. And so I think that addresses some of these ideas that folks have been mentioning about getting people of all levels involved. So I was happy to see that section in there.
Great, great.
To Commissioner Lutz's point, can the survey results be sliced and diced by age or other demographics, so we can maybe get a better idea of what the under 18 respondents say? I just wonder if that's possible with the the data you have from the survey.
Yeah, or maybe not even just under 18, but young adults as well.
Yeah, young adults. I mean, yeah, however you want to.
I think the survey, when it was sent out, it was I think it was asked for 18. It could be 18 or older. So it's kind of like as an adult in the house was asked to answer the survey. So we can I will definitely, I think the first comment was provide the results of the demographics and compare those to what Kenmore's profile is. So I'll bring that back to you. And then the other questions about future needs, again, that's really getting into the demands and needs, looking at what the trends are in growth, where you expect the growth to be, what that demographic will look like, what are the trends for recreation needs and wants. So some of that information will be coming forward as well. Oops, went too fast. So goal 5 is getting more at the programming aspect and community events. And I think the city model will continue to be providing the facilities and partnering with others for programming. So I have not heard anything from the council that there's a willingness for a shift in that model. So I think that is the model that we are trying to reflect here.
I guess I would maybe just reiterate the earlier point about residents with information about recreation program in Kenmore. To the extent there isn't certain recreation programming that people want that's outside of Kenmore, is that within our bounds to, I guess you're going to check and see what's available, but to provide it if there aren't certain types of activities people want that aren't in Kenmore but are close by, that we can have the information function.
Right. So I think in the survey, one of the questions that was asked was how your needs are being met. So it wasn't necessarily are your needs being met in Kenmore, it's how your needs are being met. But I don't think it got into the level of detail about, if you play soccer, are you going to another city to do it, or are you, doing a dance class in Kirkland or something? It didn't get to that level, but I think it was, are your needs being met? Not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean your needs have to be met in Kenmore. But let me take a look at the survey and see what we can pull out of that. Okay. So moving right along, and this was engaging the community. And again, I think this was adding this in and being deliberate about this and being mindful that there is a need to engage the community and particularly involve them in the update and the different ways of doing that and the different things that you need to look at when you're doing updates, whether it's an inventory or a survey or a demand and needs analysis. So in other words, making sure that you have sort of some truth, I guess, from the community to inform the pros plan.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing about this, I think that this is obviously really good and really important. Are there sort of, ongoing opportunities for community engagement, within the cycle of the pros plan, within the capital improvement plan, and that? I mean, there probably are existing ways for people to weigh in on their, their priorities, their goals for recreation and parks in the city? Sort of on an ongoing basis,
On an
as
ongoing
opposed
basis.
to being, as part of the plan or part of the SIP or those other processes.
I don't think the community's shy about sharing their opinions.
I just want to make sure they have the opportunity to do so.
There is, I mean, there's a but I think, this is an effort where for the pros plan in particular, that we're trying to make sure that we have sort of a statistically valid survey is important. Communities are obviously welcome to come and listen to these and provide comment. There's the website. There will be an open house probably in August. I think we're planning for another way to provide input. I think we're also planning to go to some of the community events, and I think we might be targeting the movies at the park to kind of go and talk to the public, because really that is where more local people come, because I think the concerts, it's kind of hard to, we've done that before, but we found that it was hard to find people who were specifically from Kenmore that we wanted to ask. So I think that's another way that we're going to kind of, again, start making, asking for that feedback and input in a more informal way.
Good, and do it regularly, not within just every 5 years or so.
But for sure,
Yeah.
there's definitely a more of an effort now because we're in the middle of this update. But again, I think there's, at any sort of public event, I think there's usually a city table where we're asking for feedback on a variety of things, and we could certainly add this to the list.
Just tying this back to what you said earlier, I think it's interesting to maybe try and get some more input from some of the younger citizens in our city, because I think you said that the survey was all 18 plus. And so I think because a lot of the youth make up one of the largest demographics that use the parks, and I think that's kind of interesting that some of their feedback would be some of the most valuable on what it may be missing, at least for them, or that they'd like to see in the future that might keep them, kind of sticking around and using those facilities and whatnot. And this is just kind of like, an idea. I'm just brainstorming here, but I think it would be maybe beneficial, like, for the city to go up to, say, Inglemoor High School one day out of the year. It just has to be one day. And maybe during the day, kind of connect with some of the staff up there or administration and make it known to students that, if they want their voices heard about the parks or want to get involved with the city, that they can come to this table just once during the day, collect all these kind of results and feedback and whatnot, and it might give that little bit of information that this survey could be missing. There was something else I was going to say that kind of tied in with that. If it comes to me, I'll bring it back up. Thank you.
Does the high school have a newsletter or a publication that the students read on a regular basis that we could put something in that?
Yes, they do have a
Okay.
school newspaper. The school newsletter that's sent out by administration usually goes to the parents, and it kind of misses the students altogether. And this actually, I remember what I was going to say. You talked about how we're putting it out there kind of for people to tell us when they have feedback, but sometimes it's hard to get that from students because they're not going to some of these events, and they're not all driving. They're not all,
Sure.
on blogs and whatnot online and whatnot. They're not all coming down to City Hall for these meetings, and so that way it would be more convenient for them and more likely to get that feedback as opposed to them going out, because those are very few and far between.
Okay, no, that's good, great idea, thank you.
Just a thought, you don't need to. You know.
No, well, you know, we have to sometimes, you know, you invite people to come to you, but sometimes it's important to go out as well.
Mhm. And that's why I'm suggesting Inglemore, or just as an example, because it's a school that is within the city of Kenmore, and so it you know, feeds in from mainly almost all citizens or residents of Kenmore.
Okay, thank you. Are we ready to move on to goal number 7? With bated breath, this is the last goal, I do believe. So for this one, again, if we're looking at those key values, it needs to be financially sustainable, and a system that we've created through sort of partnerships and stewardship, I think we think would be the way to go on this. So we need to make sure that there are sufficient resources. We need to plan for those resources to make sure they're available for the implementation. So really that's what this goal and objective and the underlying policies are speaking to.
I just want to say I really like P7.1.8, citywide policy for volunteer park stewardship. I think that's an outstanding idea. Does nothing like that? I know there's adopt a streets and things like that. Is there not a current, you know, organized park stewardship program within the city? Are there?
There are events where volunteers come. We have park cleanup days. There is not really a stewardship program, and I think that is something, if to implement that, even though it's saying through volunteers, even if you have volunteers, there needs to be sort of some initial resources from the city to set up that program, to provide necessary training for it to then move forward. But it is something that I think we will need to develop as we continue to grow and improve the parks. So it is something that we've put on there. Do we have a policy? Do we have a current plan? No.
Because I was going to add, I think you have a great kind of source or pool of potential volunteers for this. And so I'm just, you know, thinking that there'd be lots of, I know, student-aged youth who'd be definitely interested. They're all about volunteering, especially with a lot of the programs they have up there at school right now. And putting or getting this program implemented or in place would be very beneficial, and I don't think you'd have any trouble finding volunteers.
I'd certainly be interested in exploring that idea with a partnership with the city.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's also an opportunity to, you know, bring neighbors together, right? We have our local parks that we're all sort of, you know, live nearby and probably use more commonly. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of really positive elements of this. So, yeah.
Well, as the finance guy, this is my absolute favorite goal. I thoroughly enjoyed when we went through it. I see a lot of the stuff we did last time has made it back through here again, which is great. So much so that I could actually put up with some of the frou-frou stuff I just heard, which is nice. You know. But being serious for a moment, getting back to the whole idea of economic development, parks is a part of economic development. One of the things that I think would straighten this, and you'd really want, I think, almost have to do if you wanted to follow up on that idea of using parks as a way to generate economic benefit, is having some kind of dedicated funding. If we identify that there's an economic revenue stream that comes into the city as a result of park development, maintaining that and being able to develop over time really requires a multi-year sort of a dedicated fund that you can rely upon, and you can see that it's going to be there so that those benefits don't get swamped by other needs or other priorities or short-term economic downturns that could lead you to not maintain those parks. So we got policy 7.1.1, and we talk about budget for long-term maintenance and operational costs. maybe what we could do is strengthen that a little bit and say, look, is there an opportunity to create a dedicated fund within the city budget that would be oriented over a longer term than a single budget period, so that we knew that there were funds there. If we knew we needed to have a 5-year operating cost and maintenance fund, that we'd actually budget that and set aside revenues in advance or on an ongoing basis. We'd say, here's the revenue source, we're going to fund it into a dedicated fund, and that fund would only be exclusively used for this purpose.
So do we have a view of that, how our parks and rec is funded? What percentage comes from grants? What comes from other different sources? Because I don't know if the suggestion is that we charge more. I mean, like the Discover Pass, we don't get that money. So I'm not sure about the income. The other thing I'm wondering about is some of the projections that Rob has shown about the city costs kind of level off or start to get a little concerning out in the future. And so I'm wondering what that means in terms of this plan, as well as on a priority of the things the city is spending money on. Where does this sit, and how would it be affected long term in looking at our goals for the future?
And that will certainly be part of the financial feasibility plan, because I think, I mean, typically there is more funds available for the capital side, for actually building stuff. You know, there are park impact fees where new growth pays for new development, or at least their proportional share of it. More grants are available for building things. It's the maintenance side which I think is a challenge. And I think that is certainly going to come up when you're looking at the future financial plan, because if you look at once you build stuff, then you have to maintain stuff, and then you have to figure out them at some time you have to replace stuff as well. So I think I'm not the finance person, obviously, but that would sort of be my projection, is that when you look at this, I think the city may have to take a stronger look on the operations and maintenance side for the future, whether it's parks or roads.
I remember this was a very robust part of our conversation the last time we went through the plan.
Yeah.
And bringing that up in particular because, as you said very well, there is an episodic availability of funding for new acquisition, but then you've got that acquisition, the grants go away, and now you've got an asset that needs to be maintained or it will deteriorate over time. So that's, you know, getting back to my earlier suggestion, is in order to make that work, if we had a dedicated fund so that when we entered into a new project, we knew that there was going to be maintenance funds out there, at least for a period of time, and we identified the revenue source that we would use for that, I think that would help us steer clear of making those sorts of unfortunate decisions where we end up with unmaintained parks and we actually defeat our original purpose.
I think, you know, we're mindful of that right now. So particularly with the new parks that we're building, there was early on a lot of conversation with the Public Works Department to say, you know, if we build this, first of all, are we building something that is easy to maintain? And secondly, then you need to plan then what resources need to be available in the budget to maintain it, whether it's personnel or equipment or something. So those conversations do go on, but I really think my perspective is that the challenge is ongoing maintenance. Well, that ends my very boring PowerPoint to walk through the goals, policies and objectives, and I appreciate your comments and questions, and I've summarized those, and so we'll be revisiting some of those questions, bringing back the answers to those. Some of them may be answered in your next conversation about demands and needs, which I think a lot of these questions are kind of walking around the edges of that. So that's all I have to say tonight on this topic, unless there are any further comments or questions. And if you think of something outside of this meeting, please feel free to shoot me an email.
Okay, anything else tonight for my colleagues to bring up?
I think we had another agenda item related to the
No.
quorum for July 2nd.
Thank you for the reminder. Correct. Anything more about the pros plan first? Anybody have anything they want to weigh in on? Obviously, other opportunities, so thank you. Yeah, the next one is a confirmation of quorum for July 2nd meeting. So what would you just like us to tell you individually? What's your thought?
Well, I think my thought might be we might want to cancel that meeting because I think we might not be ready to immediately turn round with material for that meeting. So I think at your next meeting on the 25th, which is actually next week, you'll be talking about demands and needs. And then I don't think we're going to have really time to turn something quickly around for July 2nd. So if you are okay with cancelling that, then I'd be happy if you made a motion to cancel that meeting, and then you would be back next week, and then the meeting after that would be July 16th.
Okay, do I hear a motion to cancel the July 2nd meeting?
All motion.
Second?
Second?
Motion and second to cancel the July 2nd meeting. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? It passes. So where are we with mobile homes?
Yes.
I know that's not on the agenda. I'm
It
curious. It seems to have kind of gone a little quiet, and I'm just wondering what the latest
It hasn't.
is.
It hasn't gone. It's not gone quiet. We're still kind of working on following up from the last meeting on bringing forward options and how to implement the next phase. So we are working on that. I think we're probably looking at July 16th as being the next time we look at this topic. I do have to say that yesterday the city received an appeal to the Growth Board on the ordinance that adopted the mobile home park zone.
So what does that mean?
So after the council adopted an ordinance, there is a time period where somebody could appeal that to the Growth Management Hearings Board. And if there's a challenge to the Growth Management Hearings Board, they're saying that basically some aspect of that ordinance they feel is non-compliant with the Growth Management Act. I haven't read through that appeal yet, so I can't really speak to what the details are, but I'm just letting you know that there is an appeal. I guess, well, I feel like I should throw in a positive now. So the positive I can throw in is that on Monday evening, gosh, that was only last night. It was a late night last night. Council adopted the critical area regulations and shoreline master program ordinances. So that ordinance has been adopted, and we'll see where that goes, if that's appealed or not, but the council has passed it.
Thank you. Anything else for the good of the order?
Well,
Maybe-
you might not be able to answer this, but so I'm assuming that we'll hear the ARCH presentation at our next meeting, is that right?
On the
On the 25th?
Next week,
Yes?
that will actually be focused on the demands and needs analysis for the pros plan.
Okay.
And you've cancelled the July 2nd, so it'll be July 16th when we come back on the mobile home park project.
Okay.
So I would take it the timeline for us to maybe have something ready for the council before its August recess is probably not
I
in the
don't think
cards at this point?
I don't think we're going to make that.
Yeah.
So whether we give a status update to council as a staff, just a staff report to say here's where we are, here's the progress we're making, here's the next steps, we might do that, but we certainly won't be ready for a joint meeting to give you a recommendation.
Thank you. Okay, this meeting is adjourned.